When a billionaire patriarch dies, the vultures circle. Two greedy brothers claimed the sprawling Pennsylvania estate, leaving their sister with a rusted, oil-stained 1948 Ford tractor. They laughed at her inheritance, but the joke was on them, because that piece of scrap metal held a multi-million-dollar secret. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Buchanan Ingersoll and Rooney, one of Philadelphia's most prestigious corporate law firms. Inside the mahogany-paneled conference room, the air was thick with tension and the suffocating scent of expensive cologne. At the head of the long table sat attorney Mitchell Reed, a man whose 40 years of practicing estate law had taught him never to flinch, even when families tore each other apart. Across from him sat the three surviving heirs of Theodore Carmichael. Theodore had been an absolute titan of industry, a self-made magnate who built a staggering fortune in Appalachian timber and commercial real estate. He was known as much for his ruthless business acumen as for his intense, borderline paranoid eccentricities. After the 2008 financial crash, rumors circulated that Theodore had pulled tens of millions of dollars out of the banking system, terrified of an impending economic collapse. He had retreated to his crown jewel, a massive $14 million stone manor nestled on 200 acres of prime Chester County countryside. And now, at 89, he was gone. Preston, the eldest grandson, sat nearest to the lawyer, repeatedly checking the face of his platinum Rolex Daytona. He wore a bespoke Zegna suit and the impatient scowl of a man who believed the world was moving too slowly for his ambitions. Next to him was Donovan, the middle sibling, aggressively tapping on his smartphone, likely already calculating capital gains taxes. Then there was Abigail. Sitting at the far end of the table, Abigail looked like she belonged to an entirely different bloodline. Wearing a simple grey wool cardigan and sensible shoes, she was a pediatric oncology nurse who had spent the last 3 years of Theodore's life driving out to the estate every weekend to check his vitals, administer his medications, and sit with him on the wraparound porch while he ranted about the gold standard and the corruption of Wall Street. Preston and Donovan hadn't visited their grandfather in 5 years, citing their demanding portfolios. "If we could proceed, Mitchell," Preston snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "I have a flight to Zurich at 4, and this weather is already threatening my departure." Attorney Reed adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and broke the seal on the manila folder. "Very well. We are here for the reading of the last will and testament of Theodore Carmichael." Reed cleared his throat and began reading the dense legal jargon. For the first 10 minutes or so, 10 minutes, it was standard procedure. Philanthropic donations, pensions for the estate staff, and the settling of minor debts. Then came the division of the primary assets. "To my grandsons Preston and Donovan Carmichael," Reed read, his voice steady, "I leave the entirety of the Chester County estate, the manor house, the surrounding 199 acres, and all liquid capital held in the Primary Estate Trust. These assets are to be divided equally, 50-50. Preston smirked, exchanging a triumphant glance with Donovan. The estate alone was worth a fortune, and with the aggressive expansion of luxury housing developments in the area, they could flip the land to a corporate builder like Toll Brothers for triple its appraised value. They were instantly multimillionaires. Abigail didn't flinch. She hadn't expected a dime. She knew how much her brothers obsessed over the family money, and she had made her peace with living a quiet, modest life. And finally, Reed continued, flipping to the last page. The room fell dead silent. "To my granddaughter, Abigail Carmichael, I leave the final 1-acre plot on the eastern boundary of the estate, specifically the collapsed eastern barn, and the 1948 Ford Model 8N tractor housed within it." Preston let out a loud, barking laugh. Donovan covered his mouth, his shoulders shaking with suppressed amusement. A rusted tractor, Preston sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. Are you joking? The old man left her a piece of scrap metal and a pile of rotting wood? That entire barn has been condemned since 2012. Abigail's cheeks flushed, but she kept her chin high. It was his favorite tractor, she said quietly. He taught me how to drive it when I was 9 years old. It has sentimental value. Sentimental value doesn't pay the property taxes, Abby, Donovan chuckled, pocketing his phone. But hey, you can always sell it for scrap. Might get $200 for the iron if you find a desperate junkyard. Attorney Reed looked at Abigail with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. Ms. Carmichael, the title for the tractor and the deed for that specific single acre have already been transferred to your name. There are no further assets. Thank you, Mr. Reed, Abigail said gracefully, standing up and smoothing her skirt. That will be all. As she walked out of the conference room, she could hear her brothers already loudly discussing demolition contractors and offshore accounts. The sting of rejection burned in her chest. It wasn't about the money. It was the realization that Theodore, the grandfather she had painstakingly cared for, had left her essentially nothing while rewarding the 2 grandsons who hadn't even bothered to attend his funeral. Little did she know, Theodore Carmichael was a man who played the long game, and the old man had set a trap that was about to change all of their lives. 2 weeks passed. The Chester County estate had been completely transformed into a corporate staging ground. Preston and Donovan had wasted 0 time. Within days of the will reading, they had signed a preliminary contract with a high-end luxury developer. Black SUVs and surveying crews swarmed the property daily. Preston had immediately taken out a multi-million-dollar bridge loan against the estate's projected sale value, purchasing a matte black Porsche 911 GT3 and renting a penthouse in Manhattan. Donovan was busy liquidating the antique furniture inside the manor, auctioning off Theodore's prized possessions to the highest bidders. Abigail had done her best to ignore them, focusing on her grueling 12-hour shifts at the hospital. That was until a certified letter arrived at her modest apartment on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a formal legal eviction notice drafted by her brother's lawyers. It stated that because Abigail's 1-acre plot blocked the planned access road for the new luxury subdivision, the developers had invoked an obscure local zoning loophole. The letter demanded that she remove her derelict farming equipment from the property line within 48 hours, or they would legally confiscate the tractor, demolish it, and send her the bill for the disposal. Furious but refusing to let her brothers destroy her last physical memory of her grandfather, Abigail took a personal day and drove out to the estate on Thursday morning. The eastern barn was exactly as she remembered it, a tragic, sagging structure of rotting timber, half swallowed by overgrown blackberry brambles and wild ivy. The roof had partially caved in years ago. Inside, resting on 4 flat, dry-rotted tires, sat the 1948 Ford Model 8N. It was an absolute wreck. The iconic red and grey paint was completely devoured by decades of thick, bubbling rust. The exhaust pipe was bent, the seat cushion was stripped down to the springs, and the engine block was coated in a thick concrete-like layer of ancient grease and dirt. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a decaying iron skeleton. "All right, Grandpa," Abigail whispered, patting the rusted hood. A flake of oxidized metal crumbled away under her touch. "Let's get you out of here." She had hired a local hauling service, Miller's Heavy Towing, to drag the machine back to a small rented storage unit. A booming diesel engine announced the arrival of the flatbed truck. The driver, a burly, grease-stained mechanic named Wyatt, hopped out of the cab, adjusting his work gloves. Wyatt took one look at the collapsed barn and the rusted Ford and let out a long whistle. Lady, I don't know if this thing is gonna roll. Axles look seized up tight. We're gonna have to dead drag it onto the bed. Do whatever you have to do, Abigail said, shivering in the crisp autumn air. Just please be careful with it. Wyatt unspooled a heavy, industrial-grade steel chain from the winch at the front of his flatbed. He waded through the tall weeds, feeding the chain through the rusted front axle of the tractor, securing it with a heavy click. He walked back to the truck and engaged the hydraulic winch. The flatbed groaned. The steel cable snapped taut, vibrating with immense tension. The winch whined loudly, struggling against the weight. The tractor didn't budge an inch. Wyatt frowned, increasing the hydraulic power. The front tires of the tow truck actually lifted half an inch off the dirt, but the rusty Ford remained anchored to the floor of the barn, as if it were bolted to the earth. "What the hell?" Wyatt muttered, cutting the engine. He walked back over to the tractor, kicking the rear tire. "Ms. Carmichael, something ain't right here. I've hauled a dozen of these old 8Ns in my time. They weigh about 2,000, maybe 2,500 pounds tops. My winch is rated for 12,000 pounds, and it's acting like I'm trying to pull a Sherman tank." "Is it stuck in the mud?" Abigail asked, stepping closer. "No, it's sitting on concrete," Wyatt replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knelt down in the dirt, shining a heavy-duty tactical flashlight underneath the rusted belly of the machine. "It's the tractor itself. The suspension is completely bottomed out. Look at the rear wheel weights. They're usually just cast-iron attachments, maybe 100 pounds each, but these—" Wyatt reached into his toolbox and pulled out a heavy steel pry bar. He jammed the end of the bar against the rusted, saucer-shaped wheel weight, bolted to the back rim, attempting to gauge its density. He threw his entire body weight into it. The bar clanged loudly, but the metal didn't ring like hollow iron. It produced a dull, heavy, dead thud. Wyatt's brow furrowed. "That ain't cast iron." He stood up, looking utterly baffled. "Hold on. Let me try hooking the chain to the rear drawbar. Maybe if we pull it backward, we can break the wheels free." Wyatt repositioned the truck, dragging the heavy chain to the back of the tractor. He wrapped it around the thick, rusty tow hitch, the heavy metal block attached to the rear differential. As he cranked the winch again, the immense pressure of the pull finally snapped the tractor out of its rut. But as the tractor violently lurched backward, the rusted metal hitch couldn't handle the sheer weight of whatever the machine was carrying. With a deafening crack, the heavy steel chain slipped violently off the drawbar. The heavy hook whipped upward, slicing fiercely across the back of the tractor's rear axle housing, tearing away a massive chunk of decades-old grease, rust, and industrial grey paint. Wyatt cursed, rushing forward to check the damage. Abigail hurried behind him. "I'm sorry, lady. The chain slipped." Wyatt started to apologize, but the words died in his throat. He froze, staring at the deep gouge the steel hook had just carved into the heavy metal axle. "What is it?" Abigail asked, her heart dropping. Wyatt didn't answer. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a pocket knife. He flipped the blade open and knelt down next to the massive, heavy metal housing of the rear axle. Where the rust and grey paint had been violently stripped away, the metal underneath wasn't the dark, porous black of cast iron. It was shining. Wyatt scraped the blade against the exposed metal. It didn't spark. It was soft. And it was a brilliant, unmistakable, blinding yellow. Abigail dropped to her knees in the dirt next to him, her breath catching in her throat. The heavy, overcast sunlight filtered through the broken roof of the barn, illuminating the deep gash in the metal. "Wyatt," Abigail whispered, her hands trembling. "Is that brass?" Wyatt slowly looked up at her, his eyes wide as saucers. He shook his head in absolute disbelief. "Lady, brass tarnishes. Brass turns green when it sits in a wet barn for 50 years. He touched the gleaming yellow metal with his bare, grease-stained thumb. "This didn't tarnish. It's soft. It's heavy." He swallowed hard, looking at the entire rusted structure of the Ford 8N. "Ms. Carmichael, this whole axle housing, the wheel weights, the transmission block. I think your grandfather melted down solid gold and cast it into tractor parts." The air in the barn went completely still. Abigail stared at the hulking machine, her mind racing back to Theodore's paranoid rants. "The banks will rob you blind, Abby. The only thing you can trust is something you can bury in the dirt." This wasn't just a tractor. It was a Trojan horse. A massive, moving vault disguised under a thick, convincing layer of industrial paint, artificial rust, and 70 years of farm grime. "How much?" Abigail stammered, feeling the world spin around her. "How much does a tractor block weigh?" Wyatt did the mental math, his voice barely a whisper. "If those rear weights, the axle housings, and the transmission case are cast from solid gold instead of iron, gold is roughly 2.5 times denser than iron. You're looking at maybe 2,000 pounds of solid 24-karat gold sitting right here in the dirt. 2,000 pounds of gold. At current market prices, it was worth over $60 million. More than 4 times the value of the entire Chester County estate her brothers had just inherited. Suddenly, the rusted machine didn't look like scrap metal anymore. It looked like a masterpiece. "Wyatt," Abigail said, her voice suddenly losing all its tremor, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "I need you to winch this onto the truck right now, and I need you to forget what you just saw. I will pay you double your rate, and I will hire you full-time to help me disassemble this in a secure location." Wyatt nodded slowly, a massive grin spreading across his face. "Yes, ma'am," as the winch groaned again, finally dragging the multi-million-dollar disguised vault onto the flatbed. Abigail looked back toward the sprawling manor house in the distance. Her brothers were inside, drinking champagne, celebrating their cleverness and planning their luxury development. They thought they had left her with the garbage. They had no idea that they had just practically begged her to haul away the real Carmichael fortune. But the gold was only the first layer of the secret Theodore had left behind, and what was hidden inside the engine block was about to bring the entire family empire to its knees. The flatbed truck rolled into an Iron Mountain climate-controlled storage facility in North Philadelphia, a fortress usually reserved for vintage exotic cars. Abigail had rented a double bay under a Shell LLC. For the next 3 weeks, that sterile concrete room became a secret metallurgical laboratory. Wyatt brought in heavy-duty grinders, acetylene torches, and chemical solvents. They worked under the harsh glare of halogen work lights, stripping away the brilliant disguise Theodore had engineered. The 70-year-old farm grime and industrial grey paint melted away under chemical peels, revealing the staggering truth. The rear wheel weights, the massive transmission housing, the rear axles, all of it had been meticulously sandcast in solid 24-karat gold. Abigail brought in an independent assayer, a discreet man named Winston Hayes, who usually handled high-net-worth liquidations for Sotheby's. When Winston tested the core of the transmission housing, his hands visibly shook. "It is flawless," Winston whispered, wiping his brow. Winston Hayes adjusted his jeweler's loupe, studying the serial numbers faintly stamped into the raw metal. "These numbers match bars reported missing from a private depository in Zurich back in 2009, he murmured, his voice echoing in the vast, empty storage bay. Your grandfather bypassed the entire international banking system. He physically smuggled bullion, melted it down in a private foundry, and built a machine out of pure wealth. It is a masterpiece of financial camouflage. He must have sourced this directly from Swiss vaults and poured it himself. I can arrange a private sale through syndicates in Geneva. Slowly. You cannot dump $60 million of raw gold onto the market without triggering federal alarms. Abigail just stared at the gleaming yellow transmission housing. She remembered sitting on that very seat as a little girl, completely unaware that she was riding atop an absolute fortune. The physical weight of the gold was overwhelming. Theodore had trusted her, and only her, with this colossal secret. Wyatt wiped his hands on a rag, looking equally stunned. I've wrenched on cars my whole life, Ms. Carmichael. I've never seen anything like this. The man was a mad genius. We need to be absolutely silent about this, Abigail finally whispered. But the gold was only half the mystery. While the rear of the tractor was a solid gold mine, the front half, the engine block itself, was authentic cast iron. It was heavily modified, stripped of its pistons and crankshaft. Wyatt noticed the discrepancy while attempting to separate the engine from the transmission. The block is hollowed out, Wyatt said, tapping the side of the rusted iron with a ball-peen hammer. It echoes, and there are custom titanium bolts sealing the oil pan. This isn't factory. Armed with a high-torque pneumatic drill, Wyatt broke the seals. The heavy iron pan dropped to the floor with a deafening clang. Inside the hollowed-out engine cavity sat a custom-fabricated, hermetically sealed titanium lockbox. Abigail pulled the heavy box free. Her grandfather had always been paranoid, but this level of engineering was staggering. She used a plasma cutter to slice through the high-security deadbolts. Inside the box lay a stack of thick, leather-bound ledgers and a hard drive sealed in an anti-static bag. Abigail opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous, decades-long accounting of the Carmichael family empire's darkest financial sins. Theodore hadn't only hoarded gold. He thoroughly documented every single fraudulent shell company and illegal offshore evasion scheme. He had mapped out exactly how the $14 million Chester County Manor and the liquid trust funds were tied to a massive illegal tax evasion network routed through the Cayman Islands and Liechtenstein. A handwritten note rested on top of the hard drive. My dearest Abby, the sharp, cursive ink read. If you are reading this, your brothers took the bait. They always were greedy, blind fools who loved the image of wealth more than the substance of it. The estate they inherited is a poisoned chalice. The IRS has been building a case against Carmichael Enterprises for 5 years. I hid the evidence they need right here. The gold is yours to do good in the world. The ledgers are the match to burn down the rot. Use it. Meanwhile, in the sunlit penthouse of a Manhattan building, Preston and Donovan were popping a bottle of champagne. The preliminary sale of the sprawling Chester County estate to corporate developers had been officially finalized for a staggering $22 million. They had already spent millions of their anticipated windfall on luxury cars, exclusive private club memberships, and highly leveraged margin trading on Wall Street. They felt completely untouchable, basking in the arrogant glow of sudden, unearned wealth. That Tuesday morning, Preston was reviewing the expensive architectural blueprints for a massive new ski chalet. His mobile phone suddenly rang, vibrating aggressively against the marble countertop. It was attorney Mitchell Reed. Preston scoffed, setting down his crystal champagne flute with a dismissive sigh. Mitchell, tell me you have the wire transfer confirmation, Preston demanded, expecting good news. Preston, "We have a catastrophic situation," Reed said, his voice completely frantic, entirely losing all its usual corporate polish. "Federal agents are currently at the Chester County estate. They have padlocked the main iron gates." Preston frowned deeply, waving a hand as if swatting a fly. "What are you talking about? It is merely a minor zoning issue. Just call the local township council and throw some money at them," Preston added, pouring more champagne. "It is absolutely not zoning, Preston. It is the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, flanked by the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Reed shouted loudly into the receiver, his panic palpable. "They possess a sealed federal warrant detailing decades of federal tax fraud, aggressive wire fraud, and illegal offshore banking schemes linked directly to the primary estate trust. The assets are completely frozen as of this morning. The lucrative corporate contract is completely voided by the strict federal government authorities starting right now." Donovan dropped his heavy crystal glass, watching it shatter into pieces against the imported hardwood floor. "Frozen? What do you exactly mean, frozen?" "I currently have $3 million in aggressive margin calls due on Friday afternoon," Donovan screamed, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "It means you possess absolutely nothing," Reed stated grimly, offering no sympathy. "Everything you just inherited is currently being seized under strict federal asset forfeiture laws. And frankly, boys, you need elite criminal defense attorneys immediately. I am officially withdrawing as your legal counsel effective right now." The line went dead instantly, leaving only silence. The vast Carmichael empire was swiftly collapsing in real time. The extensive ledgers Abigail had courageously handed over to the Department of Justice were flawlessly bulletproof. Theodore had meticulously kept detailed physical receipts for every single illegal transaction the sprawling corporation had ever executed. Because Preston and Donovan had eagerly, greedily signed the complex probate documents claiming total legal ownership of the massive estate and its various holding companies, they were now entirely, legally responsible for the staggering tax liabilities and severe punitive penalties firmly attached to them. Within a mere 48 hours, the Haughty brothers lost absolutely everything. They went rapidly from arrogant millionaires to the targeted subjects of a massive, devastating federal indictment. During the heavily publicized federal court hearings, Preston desperately tried to place the heavy blame entirely on his deceased grandfather. He stood nervously before the stern federal judge, wearing a terribly cheap, poorly fitted beige suit that sharply contrasted with his former bespoke Italian wardrobe. He was practically begging for judicial leniency, sweating profusely under the bright courtroom lights. Donovan simply wept uncontrollably at the wooden defense table, completely broken by the sudden, brutal, and unforgiving reality of absolute poverty that completely crushed them. The voracious national media had an absolute field day, gleefully dubbing the dramatic event the greatest generational wealth collapse in modern Pennsylvania history. True justice had finally been served coldly and efficiently. Their offshore bank accounts were permanently frozen. Preston watched his beloved black Porsche get instantly repossessed by aggressive creditors. The luxurious Manhattan penthouse lease was abruptly terminated, leaving them essentially homeless. The very toxic greed that Theodore had deeply despised had flawlessly become the perfect trap, springing violently shut on them with unforgiving, mechanical precision. Exactly 1 year later, the grand Chester County estate was ruthlessly auctioned away. It was purchased by the federal government at a fraction of its true appraised value to satisfy the monumental back taxes. Preston and Donovan managed to barely avoid federal prison time by heavily cooperating with prosecutors, but they were left utterly, irredeemably bankrupt. They were humiliatingly forced to take miserable entry-level corporate jobs just to slowly pay off their seemingly endless mounting legal debts. Far away from the chaotic noise of the busy federal courts and the miserable wreckage of her brothers and their shattered ambitions, Abigail Carmichael walked the bright, sterile halls of the new hospital wing today. This beautiful facility was located inside the renowned Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She had smartly, carefully liquidated exactly half of the hidden gold, very slowly and entirely legally, through discreet Swiss syndicates. She dutifully paid all the necessary capital gains taxes, walking away with over $25 million in completely clean, fully untraceable wealth. She never bought a massive mansion or a flashy sports car. Instead, she kept her incredibly modest apartment, continued working her exhausting nursing shifts 3 days a week, and purposefully used the vast fortune to fully fund the critical medical treatments of desperate families everywhere. These were families who simply could not afford their vital cancer care. She often sat quietly by the warm fire on cold evenings, drinking hot tea, softly smiling at the rusted badge. It perfectly represented the ultimate glorious triumph of true humility over arrogant, toxic greed in a superficial world completely obsessed with hollow, meaningless status. In her small, cozy living room, mounted beautifully above her brick fireplace, hung a single piece of rusted, dented metal. It was the original front hood emblem of a 1948 Ford tractor, a quiet reminder that true value remains proudly hidden inside. Sometimes, the most broken things hide the greatest worth, while the shiniest prizes are nothing but a trap. Abigail proved that true wealth isn't inherited. It's hidden in the quiet strength of those who care. Did you love this incredible story of karma, hidden treasure, and family betrayal? If you want more thrilling, real-life mystery stories just like this one, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with friends, and subscribe to our channel today.